There's something quietly different about people who grew up in the 1960s. The way they stay calm when things fall apart, the way they wait without complaining, the way they hope without being naive. It wasn't luck, it wasn't personality, it was something their childhood gave them. Today, we're going back to that decade to understand what it shaped inside them and why it still matters now. Growing up with uncertainty. If you grew up in the 1960s, there was a quiet feeling in the background of everyday life that's hard to explain to anyone who didn't live through it. It wasn't panic, and it wasn't fear in the way we usually think of fear. It was more like a low, distant hum. The sense that something very big, very serious, and very much out of your control existed somewhere beyond your front yard, your classroom, and your small, ordinary world. At school, you practiced duck and cover drills. The teacher would blow a whistle or ring a bell, and you would slide off your chair, crawl under your desk, tuck your head down, and cover the back of your neck with your hands. You didn't fully understand what a nuclear bomb was, but you understood enough. You knew it was powerful, you knew adults were worried about it, and you knew it was something that could change everything in a single moment. Then the drill would end. You climbed back into your seat, opened your notebook, and went right back to your spelling words or your math problems. That simple routine taught you something very deep. Very early. It taught you that two things can be true at the same time. The world can be uncertain, and you still have to do your homework. The future can be fragile, and you still have to walk home, feed the dog, and eat dinner. So instead of growing up frozen by worry, many children of the 1960s learned something else instead. They learned how to live with uncertainty. They learned to separate what they could control from what they couldn't. They learned not to waste their energy panicking about things they had no power over. They learned that worrying endlessly didn't make danger go away. It just made today harder to live. That's why, later in life, this generation often seemed unusually calm during crises. When you've grown up knowing the world might not be permanent, smaller problems don't feel quite so overwhelming. You focus on what's in front of you, you do what you can, and you let the rest go. That quiet emotional skill didn't come from books or therapy sessions. It came from desks, drills, and the strange balance of childhood in a complicated world. And it stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Did your school ever practice duck and cover drills or anything like it? Seeing the world change overnight. One Sunday night in February of 1964, something happened that quietly rewired the way an entire generation saw the world. Families across America were sitting in their living rooms, gathered around one television set, doing what they always did on Sunday night, when four young men from Liverpool appeared on the screen. The screaming from the studio audience was so loud you could barely hear the music. Teenagers were crying, parents were confused, and nobody quite understood what they were watching yet. But children did. They didn't have the words for it, but they felt it. They were witnessing the birth of something new, something that didn't belong to their parents and didn't follow the old rules. The Beatles didn't just change music. They showed a generation that the world could shift overnight, that culture was not fixed, and that what felt permanent could suddenly feel outdated in the space of a single broadcast. For a child, that realization is powerful. It teaches you that change doesn't always come slowly, one step at a time. Sometimes it arrives all at once, loud, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. So instead of fearing change later in life, many children of the 1960s grew up expecting it. They learned that new ideas can replace old ones, that new voices can rise quickly, and that disruption is not always a threat. Sometimes it's just the world moving forward. This shaped a generation that was less attached to the way things have always been done. They had seen tradition bend in real time, watched adults struggle to keep up with something young and unfamiliar, and survived it. That experience created adults who were less frightened by cultural shifts, technological changes, and social transformations. When the world changed later, when computers arrived, when the internet appeared, when jobs and industries shifted, it didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like something they had seen before. Something strange at first, something uncomfortable, and then, slowly, something normal. There's a quiet confidence that comes from growing up watching the world reinvent itself. You stop believing that change is a disaster. You start believing it's a pattern. Things change, people adapt, and life goes on. And that belief becomes emotional stability. Do you remember where you were the first time you saw the Beatles on television? Hope mixed with loss. The 1960s were not only about change and excitement, they were also a decade of sudden loss. For the first time, many children watched history unfold, not in books, but live on television. They saw faces they trusted, admired, and believed in suddenly disappear. President John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy. One after another within just a few short years. For a child, that kind of repetition leaves a mark. You begin to understand, even without being told, that the world is not fair in simple ways. That good people do not always get to finish their work. That progress does not move in a straight, clean line from bad to better. And yet, something very important happened inside this generation at the same time. They did not stop believing in progress, they simply stopped believing it was guaranteed. They learned that hope is real but fragile. That change is possible but costly. That fighting for something better does not promise safety or reward. It only promises meaning. This created a very specific emotional balance. People who can care deeply without being naive. Who can believe in something without assuming it will work out perfectly. Who can keep showing up even when the outcome is uncertain. It is not cynicism. It is not bitterness. It is something quieter and stronger than both. It is the ability to hope without illusion. Later in life, this made them steady leaders, steady parents, steady friends. They did not collapse when things went wrong, and they did not panic when systems failed. They had already seen big things fall apart, and they had learned that life continues anyway. They became people who understand that disappointment is not the end of meaning, that grief does not cancel purpose, that losing something does not erase the value of having believed in it. So when the world felt unstable again later in life, they did not retreat into denial, and they did not drown in despair. They adjusted, they grieved, they adapted, and they kept going. Growing up independent. One of the quiet gifts of growing up in the 1960s was how early you were trusted with the real world. Not a simulated version of it, not a padded or softened one, but the actual thing. At a very young age, you were allowed to move through life on your own. You walked to school, you crossed streets, you went to the corner store with a few coins in your pocket and a small list in your head. That simple independence shaped you in ways that lasted far longer than childhood. You learned how to watch your surroundings. You noticed which streets felt safe, which houses felt friendly, and which corners to avoid. You learned how to read faces, how to listen to tone, how to sense when something felt right or wrong. These weren't lessons taught in classrooms. They were absorbed through repetition, through everyday movement, through being responsible for yourself in small but meaningful ways. Money itself was a lesson. You didn't swipe a card or tap a phone. You held your money in your hand. You felt its weight. You watched it disappear as you spent it, and you watched it grow when you saved it. You learned that choices have consequences and that spending meant giving something up. That physical relationship with money made responsibility feel real, not abstract. You also learned to manage time. You had to be home when the streetlights came on. You had to leave early enough to make it to school on time. Nobody sent you reminders. Nobody tracked your location. You were trusted to remember, to plan, and to show up. And when you made mistakes, you learned from them. You were late. You forgot something. And life gently corrected you. This created adults who trust themselves. People who don't panic when they are alone with a problem. People who assume they can figure things out. People who don't immediately look for someone else to take over. They grew up knowing that competence is built, not given. That confidence comes from doing, not being told you're capable. And that freedom is not something handed to you. It is something you slowly grow into. Pain was normal, not a crisis. If you grew up in the 1960s, you probably got hurt. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways that made the evening news, but in the small, ordinary ways that come from being a child who lives outside. You fell off your bike. You scraped your knees. You bumped your head climbing a tree. You burned a finger on something you were told not to touch. And when you came home bleeding or bruised, something very different happened than what happens today. Your parents looked at you. They checked if anything was broken, and if it wasn't, they said something simple. You're fine. Then they cleaned you up, maybe put on a bandage, and sent you back outside. That wasn't neglect, it was trust. They trusted that your body knew how to heal. They trusted that pain was not the same thing as danger. They trusted that learning your limits was part of growing up. So instead of learning that every discomfort is a crisis, you learned something else. You learned that hurt does not mean harm. That pain does not mean panic. That difficulty does not mean disaster. You learned that your body is strong, that feelings pass, that most things that hurt you don't destroy you. This changed the way this generation handles discomfort later in life. They don't rush to label every struggle as trauma. They don't assume that something is wrong just because something is uncomfortable. They know that growth often comes with a little pain attached to it. They are not fearless. They are resilient. They don't chase danger, but they don't run from it either. They understand the difference between risk and recklessness, between challenge and catastrophe. This makes them steady under pressure. They can sit with discomfort without needing to escape it immediately. They can feel pain without letting it define them. They can experience loss, frustration, or stress without believing that something is fundamentally broken. That is a quiet kind of strength. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't seek attention, but it holds people together when things get hard. Learning through real tools. Children in the 1960s were trusted with real things, not toy versions of the world and not soft, padded copies of reality, but actual tools, actual machines, and real responsibility. You were handed a wrench and shown how an engine worked, taught how to use a sewing machine with a fast-moving needle and real thread, and given chemistry sets that bubbled, smoked, and sometimes smelled strange. You were allowed to use sharp scissors, hot stoves, and heavy objects. And yes, you could get hurt, but that was part of the lesson. You weren't taught to fear complexity, you were taught to respect it. You learned to slow down, to pay attention, and to be careful. You learned that the world is not fragile, but it is powerful, and that power deserves awareness, not avoidance. This created adults who are not intimidated by how things work. People who assume they can understand a system instead of being overwhelmed by it. People who believe that most problems can be approached and sometimes solved if you are willing to look closely and try. They grew up taking things apart and putting them back together again. Radios, bicycles, toys, small engines, kitchen appliances. And when something broke, the first instinct was not to throw it away or call an expert. It was to see if it could be fixed. This builds a very particular mindset. It builds patience because nothing works the first time. It builds curiosity because every object becomes a question waiting to be answered. It builds confidence because every small success reinforces the belief that you can figure things out. And it also builds humility because you learn that mistakes are part of learning, not evidence of failure. Later in life, this becomes a powerful psychological tool. These are people who don't freeze in front of complexity, who don't immediately outsource responsibility, and who don't panic when something stops working. They lean in, they observe, they try, they adjust, and they try again. Even when they cannot fix the problem, they walk away knowing they could learn if they had to. That sense of internal competence is one of the quiet strengths of this generation. It makes the world feel less threatening, it makes change feel manageable, and it makes people feel capable, even when things are unfamiliar. Waiting as a way of life. One of the most powerful and invisible skills people learned growing up in the 1960s was how to wait. Not just how to be patient in a polite way, but how to live with anticipation. How to sit inside wanting something without being consumed by it. If you wanted to see a new movie, you went to the theater downtown and you saw what was playing. If it wasn't there yet, you waited. There was no on-demand, no instant access, no guarantee that what you wanted would be available exactly when you wanted it. If you missed it, you might never see it again. The same was true for music. You sat by the radio hoping the DJ would play your favorite song. You waited through songs you didn't care about, commercials you had memorized, and static that came and went. And when the song finally started, you rushed to press record, praying you didn't miss the beginning. Television worked the same way. You waited a full week for the next episode. Cliffhangers lived in your mind for days, sometimes for months. There was no skipping ahead, no binge watching, no shortcuts. Just time and the space between desire and fulfillment. That space did something important to the human mind. It taught people that wanting is not a problem, that anticipation is not suffering, that waiting is not empty time. It is time filled with imagination, curiosity, and emotional buildup. This created adults who are comfortable with delay, who don't panic when things take time, who don't feel cheated when gratification isn't instant. They understand that some of the best parts of life happen before you actually get what you want. The planning, the dreaming, the wondering, the hoping. These are not obstacles, they are part of the experience. Which memory from the 1960s do you still remember most clearly today? Social intelligence from unsupervised play. One of the most powerful classrooms of the 1960s was not a school building at all. It was the backyard, the sidewalk, the empty lot, the creek behind the neighborhood, and the front steps where kids gathered after school and on summer evenings. Children played without adults watching over them, without referees, without someone stepping in every time feelings were hurt or rules were broken. When someone argued about whether they were tagged or not, the children worked it out themselves. When someone felt left out, the group decided whether to include them or let them go home. Every social moment was something you had to navigate on your own. That constant practice created something very rare. It created children who became careful observers of other people. You learned quickly who was trustworthy, who exaggerated, who told secrets, and who kept them. You learned which parents welcomed you into their homes and which ones expected you to knock and wait. You learned how to sense tension in a group before it exploded into a fight and how to smooth things over before they got worse. You learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to push, and when to step back. None of this was taught directly. There were no lessons on empathy or communication. There were no workshops on emotional intelligence. There was just experience, repeated every day, shaping your instincts slowly and quietly. Over time, children of the 1960s developed what we now call social intelligence, the ability to read a room, to sense unspoken emotions, and to understand that what people say and what they mean are often two different things. The moon landing effect. On July the 20th, 1969, something happened that permanently expanded the imagination of an entire generation. Children sat in front of black and white television sets in living rooms, classrooms, and community halls, watching grainy images of something that had never happened before. A human being in a bulky white suit stepped onto the surface of the moon. It did not feel like science. It did not feel like technology. It felt like magic. It felt like the boundary of what was possible had just moved. For a child, that moment does something profound. It tells you that limits are not always real. That what adults say cannot be done might simply not have been done yet. That human creativity and determination can reach far beyond what feels reasonable or safe or familiar. It creates a deep internal belief that the world is not closed, that the future is not fixed, and that imagination has real power. This belief stayed with the children who watched that moment. When they grew older and faced their own impossible problems, they carried with them the memory of having seen the impossible become real. They had watched humans reach across space and touch something no one had ever touched before. That experience becomes a psychological anchor. When life feels too big, too complex, or too overwhelming, part of you remembers that humanity has already done things far more difficult than what you are facing now. This does not make people reckless or unrealistic. It makes them quietly brave. It gives them the courage to try things that might not work, to invest in ideas that might fail, and to believe that effort itself has value even when the outcome is uncertain. We guessed that it shifts the emotional question from, is this guaranteed, to, is this worth trying? That is a very different way to live. It makes people less afraid of failure and more interested in possibility. It makes them more tolerant of uncertainty and more open to ambition. And it makes them less likely to dismiss something simply because it feels difficult or unfamiliar. The moon landing did not just change science. It changed what a generation believed was worth attempting. It taught them that human beings are capable of more than they are comfortable imagining, and that sometimes the most important step is simply deciding to reach. Do you remember where you were when you first saw the moon landing on television? Vietnam and the loss of innocence. The same decade that showed children humans could walk on the moon also showed them that humans could do terrible things to one another. For the first time, war was not something distant or hidden in history books. It entered living rooms through the television screen. Families ate dinner while images of jungles, helicopters, wounded soldiers, and body bags played quietly in the background. Children absorbed these images without fully understanding them, but understanding enough. They learned that the world was not always safe, that adults did not always make wise decisions, that authority was not always correct simply because it was authority. This did not make them rebellious for the sake of rebellion. It made them thoughtful. It made them cautious about power. It taught them to look at actions, not titles, and to judge leadership by results, not promises. This shaped a generation with a complicated but healthy relationship to institutions. They can respect systems that work and question systems that do not. They can follow leaders who earn trust and resist those who demand it. They learned that loyalty should be based on integrity, not position, and that questioning is not disrespect, but responsibility. Later in life, this made them independent thinkers. They do not automatically accept the loudest voice in the room. They do not confuse confidence with competence. They are slow to be impressed and quick to notice inconsistency. They understand that real wisdom often speaks quietly and that real danger often announces itself loudly. This is why people from this generation tend to value experience over credentials and character over image. They have seen what happens when authority goes unchecked, and they carry that memory with them as a form of moral awareness. This does not make them cynical. It makes them discerning. It makes them careful about who they trust and deliberate about what they support. It gives them a grounded sense of responsibility for their own beliefs instead of outsourcing that responsibility to institutions, movements, or slogans. Boredom and Creativity. Growing up in the 1960s meant having something that feels almost impossible today. Empty time, real boredom. Not the restless kind that comes from scrolling too fast or switching between too many choices, but the quiet kind that comes from nothing happening at all. There was no endless stream of entertainment waiting in your pocket. When a television ended for the day or switched to something boring, the house went quiet. When your friends were busy, you were alone. When the weather was bad or the day was long, you simply had nothing to do. And that nothing turned out to be something. In that quiet space, the mind had room to wander. You stared at the ceiling. You lay in the grass and watched clouds drift by. You wandered through the neighborhood with no destination. You built forts out of scrap wood. You invented games with rules only you understood. You took ordinary objects and turned them into stories, worlds, and adventures. Without realizing it, children of the 1960s were exercising the parts of the brain responsible for imagination, reflection, and creative problem solving. They were learning how to sit with their own thoughts, how to follow an idea from beginning to end, and how to connect things that did not obviously belong together. This built an inner life that was rich, flexible, and resilient. Later in life, this became a powerful psychological resource. These are adults who can sit in silence without discomfort, who do not need constant stimulation to feel okay, who are not afraid of being alone with their thoughts. They can think deeply because they have practiced thinking without distraction. This also makes them better at seeing patterns, noticing subtle connections, and imagining alternatives when the obvious solution does not work. They are less likely to panic when there is no immediate answer, because they are comfortable letting an idea take time to unfold. In a world that moves fast and demands constant attention, this capacity for stillness has become rare and valuable. It allows people to slow down when slowing down is necessary, to reflect when reflection is needed, and to imagine when imagination is required. What was one thing you were allowed to do as a kid that would surprise people today? Failure was not softened. Growing up in the 1960s also meant learning how to lose. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways meant to shame or punish, but in small, ordinary moments that quietly built emotional strength. You failed a test, you lost a game, you weren't picked for the team, you didn't get the part in the school play. And when that happened, something important did not occur. Nobody rushed in to fix the feeling for you. Nobody pretended you had won when you hadn't. Nobody gave you a trophy for simply showing up. You were allowed to feel disappointed. You were allowed to feel embarrassed. You were allowed to feel sad, frustrated, or left out. And then, just as quietly, you were expected to move on. This taught you something very valuable. It taught you that failure is survivable, that disappointment is uncomfortable but not dangerous, that losing does not erase your worth, and that winning does not define it either. So instead of growing up terrified of mistakes, this generation grew up learning from them. Failure became information. It became feedback. It became something you could use instead of something you had to avoid at all costs. This made them steady in the face of setbacks. When a job fell through, when a relationship ended, when a plan didn't work out, they did not collapse. They felt the disappointment, they processed it, and then they adjusted. They did not expect life to be fair all the time, so they were not shocked when it wasn't. They did not expect every effort to be rewarded, so they were not paralyzed when it wasn't. They understood that effort matters even when the outcome is uncertain. This creates adults who are resilient rather than fragile. People who can stand in discomfort without running from it. People who can accept criticism without falling apart. People who can take responsibility without drowning in shame. They know that falling is not failure. Staying down is. Holding hope and hurt together. People who grew up in the 1960s learned something that is becoming rare today. They learned how to hold two opposite feelings at the same time without needing to resolve the tension between them. They learned how to believe in a better future while still understanding that nothing is guaranteed. They learned how to hope without becoming naive and how to face reality without becoming cynical. They saw the world change in beautiful ways. They saw new voices rise, new ideas take shape, and new possibilities open up. They also saw the world break in painful ways. They saw leaders fall, wars unfold, and promises fail. And instead of choosing one story over the other, they learned to live with both. This made them emotionally steady in a very particular way. They do not expect life to be fair, but they still believe it can be meaningful. They do not expect people to be perfect, but they still believe people are worth caring about. They do not expect the future to be safe, but they still show up and invest in it anyway. This is not confusion. It is maturity. It allows them to stay engaged with the world instead of retreating from it. It allows them to care deeply without being overwhelmed. It allows them to remain hopeful without being constantly disappointed. Listening to the radio often went hand in hand with another behavior that enriched the music experience. You listened to the record from beginning to end. Music was a structured journey. You studied the album cover, you learned the lyrics, and you shared vinyl records like they were treasures. This created a deeper appreciation for the music and the artists, a quality this generation still carries. It was a unique combination of old-fashioned innocence and a fresh, revolutionary spirit. This made life feel slower and more meaningful. We know that for those who grew up in the 60s, it truly was the greatest decade. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. We'll see you in the next one.